Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. Hey everybody, this is Russ, and thanks so much for listening to the Key Chapters podcast. As you probably know, I'm on sabbatical right now, so what we're doing is we're uploading episodes from last year. That means the audio may not be great at times, or maybe even have some glitches here and there. So thank you for your grace and your patience, and I hope this podcast just continues to be a blessing to you in your walk with the Lord. So with that, here we go with today's episode. Well, let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 8. Starting with the context here, you'll remember that Israel is in a process of transitioning from leadership by judges to leadership by kings. For several decades now, they have been in this situation where they're just getting beat up by the Philistines. Now, the Philistines were the sophisticated culture. We tend to think of like the Jews being sophisticated, but not so much. Really, the Philistines were the one where they were the power brokers. They had the technology. They had just the society in place. In chapter 10, for instance, they have soldiers garrisoned within the regions of the people of Israel. In chapter 13, the Philistines were the metal workers, and they were the ones who controlled just the how to work with metal, and they refused to allow the Israelites to learn the trade. And so the Israelites were beholden to the Philistines, and they just felt like the total underdog in the whole situation. And they're just looking around saying, what are we going to do to fix this situation? And they just see these other nations there and thinking, if I could just copy those other nations, then we will finally have success. Well, we're going to see that's not so much the case. So chapter 8 opens. It's not quite 30 years, but it's like 27 years or so since chapter 4, where Eli and his sons died. You might remember that Hophni and Phinehas, they carried the ark into battle. They were killed. Eli gets the news and he dies as well. Well, obviously, with Eli and his sons dead, Samuel is then in a place to take things over, and so he does, and he basically has been leading for nearly 30 years in this kind of quiet, faithful fashion. Verse 1 lets us know that Samuel's old. Now, by their definition, he's old. By ours, maybe not so much, or maybe people would be insulted if they heard this. He's roughly around 60 years old or so, and so that's just kind of getting on. So he appoints his sons to judge Israel. But verse 3 tells us that's not so great, because his sons do not walk in his way. They've turned after dishonest gain. They've taken bribes. They've perverted justice. That is not what the people want. They're used to Samuel being faithful. They don't want that. And so all of the leadership of Israel get together. They talk about the whole situation. What are you going to do? This is verse 4. Then in verse 5, they go to Samuel and they say, you know what? Appoint a king for us to judge us like the nations. You might remember that when the Jews crossed the Jordan River, they came into the land of Canaanites, and right away they're doing battle against communities that are being ruled by folks called kings. And the Jews figure, well, that's the solution to their problem. Well, Samuel's not too pleased with this, and I love how in verse 6 he turns to the Lord. He pours out his heart to the Lord, and the Lord lets him know in verses 7 and 8, they're not rejecting Samuel, they're rejecting him. And that's because God's plan all along, his design, was that the people would walk with him personally and serve him directly. They wouldn't need a king because they would have him to lead them. But it has been so long that the people have just been kind of fighting against the Lord that he's like, you know what, just go ahead and grant them their request. But let them know about the pitfalls of having a king over them. And so that's exactly what Samuel does in verses 10 through 17. He tells them things like, hey, this king, he's going to draft your sons into military service. He's going to conscript the people into civil service. He's going to tax you heavily. He's going to make you his servants. And then he gives a very stern warning in verse 18. He says, then you will, once you have the king, you realize what you've done. He says, then you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. Well, you'd think the people would hear this and be, maybe we should reconsider this. But they don't. And they say in verse 20 that they want a king to be like the nation, so that the king may judge them and go out before them to fight their battles. And so they have lost trust in the Lord to fight for them. They think the solution is going to be in some man, and so now they want this king. And as far as they're concerned, this king is going to solve all their problems. And so once again, Samuel brings all of this to the Lord, and the Lord just encourages him, it's okay, go ahead and appoint the king. And so that's where the chapter ends. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to a few nuggets in this passage. For one thing, I think it's just so cool about Samuel's age. At this point, he's not a whippersnapper. And when you think about Samuel, the Samuel that we all know, we know Samuel like getting born, and then we know Samuel during this episode here. He's something like 60 years old or so, and here he's been serving for decades, basically anonymously but faithfully serving the Lord. Now, the people respect him, but it wasn't because of everything he's about to do. It's because of his faithful, consistent obedience all along. And I just love that. I'm so encouraged that the man we know, the man we think about when we think about Samuel, basically all of the cool stuff we think about happens when he's more or less an old man, when he was more or less getting ready to go out to pasture and have somebody else take the lead. But still, God has work for him to do. And yet along those lines, although we see Samuel being this godly guy, we have to reckon with the fact that his kids were not following the Lord. And that's just an example there where Samuel is a godly man, and no doubt he was teaching his family the word of God. They were actually priests, and so they knew how this all worked. But a godly man being a godly parent doesn't guarantee that those kids are going to come to faith. Ultimately, the responsibility for their faith rests between them and God. And so here we see Samuel being this good, godly man, and this is a tragedy that they don't walk with the Lord, but maybe just the principle here that sometimes there are other factors at play besides just the faithfulness of the parents. And every child and every teenager, they have to personally themselves come to the Lord and submit to him and surrender to him as Lord. And there's only so much their parents can do in those situations. Okay, another nugget from this passage. You got this situation where the Jews are looking around and saying, man, these Philistines have such power, and we're not going to be able to defeat them until we level the playing field. So they've got kings, we've got to get kings. And sometimes people fall into this trap where we need to look to the world for how to do things, that they somehow have this figured out, that we're kind of just like the backward guys. But that's not the case. The problem here in Israel wasn't that they didn't have a king. It was a spiritual issue. They were supposed to be submitted to God, to walk with him, obey him, take him at his word, and that's a struggle for them. And no amount of worldly wisdom is going to give them a solution to their problems until they are first submitted to the Lord. Along these lines, we can even see what their motivation is in verse 20. They're looking for a king to judge them and go out before them and fight their battles. This is something that we can all kind of fall into, where we're looking to other people to be our crutch in life. Maybe we're looking to someone to give us wisdom or guidance or direction. We pray to the Lord a little bit, but then we go talk to someone and say, hey, here's my situation. What do you think? And we really are looking to other people to solve our problems when we really need to be going to the Lord and pursuing him and following him and not looking for someone else to fix our situation, but just going to the Lord and being faithful and obeying what he has said, knowing that he will direct our path as we walk with him. Now, there's another nugget here, and that's in verse 18, and this one's kind of a frightening nugget because this is a warning that there are times when we are so stubbornly going down our own path. Remember verse 18, the Lord's like, you know what? When you call out to the Lord will not answer you in that day. And there are times when we can just get so stubborn in our ways. We're just going to demand our thing. We're going to want that, do that. Doesn't matter what anybody says. And when we come to our senses after a while, because often God will allow that, we come to our senses and we call out to him. And we find my situation is not getting better. If you've ever experienced that, just to encourage you, on the one hand, God's help in those days may not be immediate or it may not be in the form we want, but it's not as though he fully renounces us, because we're going to see through the rest of the Old Testament, he still walks with his people. He still answers their prayer. But during those times when we've been so just adamant, we're going to follow our way, it doesn't matter what God says, God may leave us to ourselves for a bit to kind of walk that path and realize, yeah, you know what? God's way was the right way. And when we do repent and when we do come to him, he will bring us back to the path that he calls us to, but there may be just some suffering and some pain in that as well. And that brings us to the last nugget, which is the most important of all. Back in verse 7, they are rejecting God as their king. This is pretty much the story of the entire Bible. But here's the thing. For us as Christians, we are essentially renouncing this mindset. True Christians who are following the Bible are people who are restored back to God as their king. Now, who's our king? Jesus is our king. He came to be our king. Now, we might live among the nations, and we ought to be great citizens of every country that we ever would live in, but we are ultimately those who come back to God and say, I want you to be my king. I'm going to follow your ways. I'm going to be one of your citizens. I will let you rule me and rule my life. And so we come to God and we surrender to him as our Lord and God and King. I remember that it took me a while to kind of figure this out. I didn't fully understand that I am called out of this world to be a citizen of his kingdom. And so if maybe you've been going to church for a bit and thinking, well, there's all these other reasons for it, and if Jesus as your king isn't one of them, how about spending some time as we close right now, going to the Lord and saying, you know what? I don't want to be a person who's throwing off your kingship. I want to accept and embrace your kingship and just surrender your heart and your life today to Jesus as your Lord and God and King. And as you do so, He will go before you, He will guide you, He will walk with you, He will strengthen you, and He'll enable you to live the life He has called you to do. Well, that's a great place to stop right there, and we'll pick things on up tomorrow in chapter 9, and we'll see you then. Have a great day, and God bless.